The frozen dawn crept across the battlefield like a silent thief. Smoke curled above the ruined horizon, where fields once green now lay charred and shattered by artillery. In a half-collapsed bunker, Captain Alexander Morozov rubbed frost from his rifle's iron sight and looked at the men who remained. 30 soldiers. That was all. Once they had been 300, but the war had carved them down to a fraction. Their orders were simple: hold the line until reinforcements arrived. Reinforcements that, deep down, Alexander knew might never come. "Sir," Sergeant Karamov muttered, his breath a pale cloud, "they're massing again." Alexander nodded. On the ridge, dark shapes gathered, enemy armor, infantry, the promise of annihilation. The men knew what was coming. None flinched. They had fought together through fire and blood, and now they stood on the last front, one ridge between the enemy and the capital beyond. "This is it," Alexander whispered to himself. "The last front. No further." He rose to address his men. The men gathered around the battered ammunition crates. Their faces were drawn with exhaustion, eyes hollowed by nights without sleep. Yet when Alexander spoke, they listened with a silence forged by trust. "Brothers," he began, "today we fight not for medals, not for glory, but for the people who sleep in their homes behind us. If we fall, they fall. If we stand, they live." Private Petrov, the youngest, barely 20, clutched his rifle tighter. Beside him, Corporal Ivanov lit a final cigarette, offering it around as if sharing one last ritual. Even Karamov, scarred and grizzled, placed a steadying hand on Petrov's shoulder. "We've been through hell together," Karamov said. "We'll go through one more." The men nodded, their silence stronger than any oath. They knew they would not survive, but they also knew their deaths would not be in vain. In the distance, the enemy's artillery thundered. The earth trembled as the barrage began. Shells rained down, shaking the bunker, tearing the ground apart. Dust filled the air, but the men did not break. Alexander raised his hand. "To the trenches!" They scrambled into position, rifles and machine guns at the ready. The storm was coming. The enemy came with a roar. Rows of infantry surged forward, their bayonets gleaming in the pale light, supported by tanks grinding across the frozen soil. The defenders opened fire. Machine guns rattled, rifles cracked, grenades burst with thunderous shock. Men fell screaming, torn apart in the killing field before the ridge. But still they came, wave after wave. Petrov fired until his rifle's barrel smoked, his hands trembling as he reloaded. Ivanov barked encouragement, his machine gun spitting fire that cut swathes through the advancing troops. Karamov stood tall in the trench, shouting targets, his voice a beacon amid the chaos. A tank shell smashed into the ridge, blasting rock and dirt skyward. Alexander was thrown to the ground, his ears ringing, but he staggered back up, rallying his men. "Hold! Hold the line!" he bellowed. For every enemy that climbed the ridge, 2 defenders dragged him down. The air filled with smoke, blood, and the screams of the dying. Hours blurred into a haze of violence. But slowly, too slowly, the 30 dwindled. Men were cut down beside their brothers, their bodies falling into the mud. By noon, less than 20 remained. Still, the ridge held. By nightfall, the defenders were shadows of men. Ammunition was nearly gone, water scarce, and the wounded moaned softly in the darkness of the bunker. The enemy had pulled back temporarily, regrouping for a final assault. Alexander sat against a wall, his uniform torn and bloodied, a deep gash on his arm hastily bandaged. His eyes were heavy, but his resolve was sharp as steel. Karamov approached, kneeling beside him. "We can't hold another wave. We're down to scraps of ammo." Alexander nodded. "Then we'll make every bullet count." Petrov, who had been silent all day, suddenly spoke. "Captain, if we fail, what happens to them?" "The city." Alexander looked at him, his heart aching. "Then we will make sure we don't fail. Even if it costs us everything." The men shared what little food and drink remained. Ivanov passed the last cigarette to Petrov, who smoked it awkwardly, coughing but smiling faintly. It was a soldier's ritual, the calm before the final storm. In the distance, the rumble began again. Tanks. Hundreds of footsteps. The enemy was coming with everything they had. Alexander rose. "This is it. The last stand." No retreat. The men formed ranks, their silhouettes lit by the flares exploding above. The night turned to fire. The ground shook as the enemies surged forward in their greatest attack. Artillery blazed, machine guns roared, and the ridge became a furnace of steel and fire. Alexander led from the front, his rifle barking until the bolt locked empty. He drew his pistol, firing into the mass of enemy troops scrambling up the slope. Karamov fought like a man possessed, rallying the survivors. Ivanov's machine gun chattered until the belt ran dry. Petrov, despite his fear, stood his ground, throwing grenades until his pouch was empty. The enemy pressed closer, their numbers endless. Hand-to-hand combat erupted in the trench, bayonets, knives, fists, raw desperation. Soldiers fell in brutal silence, one after another, until only a handful of defenders remained. Ivanov was struck by shrapnel, collapsing with a final curse. Karamov dragged Petrov to cover, shielding him with his own body as bullets tore through his chest. Still, he kept firing until his last breath. Alexander fought with grim fury, each shot a vow, each strike a promise. But the enemy climbed over the bodies of the fallen, overwhelming the ridge. When his pistol clicked empty, Alexander drew his bayonet, roaring into the tide. "This is our land. You will not pass." The last defenders fell one by one, their blood soaking the earth they swore to protect. When dawn broke, the ridge was silent. Smoke curled upward from the ruins, and the enemy's advance had stalled. Hundreds of bodies lay scattered across the slope, enemy and defender alike. Reinforcements arrived at last, storming the battlefield. The enemy, battered and bloodied by the desperate defense, withdrew. The capital was safe. Among the fallen, Captain Alexander's body was found at the forefront of the trench, his bayonet still clutched in his hand. Around him lay his men, brothers who had given their last breath to hold the line. Their sacrifice had bought precious hours. Their stand had turned the tide. In the capital, bells rang not in mourning, but in remembrance. Songs were written, monuments built. But the truest legacy lay in the silence of that ridge, where 30 men had stood against an army, and held. For they had fought on the last front, and their sacrifice became eternal.